Section 7. Weird Tales Presents Mad Science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Yoganand. Weird Tales Presents Mad Science. Section 7. A Hand from the Deep by Romeo Poole. Somewhere near midnight, my room telephone rang, and according to well-formed habit, I rolled out of bed and answered almost before I was fully awake. "Ambulance trip for you, Marsh? Whitby home." That brought me wide awake, and hustling into trousers, shoes, shirt, and white uniform coat, I descended to the main office. Dr. Lang, the superintendent, met me at the foot of the stairs with a heavy overcoat. "Here," he said. "Put this on. It's a pretty chilly night. Here's your bandage kit. You may need it. Ambulance in the back drive. Explosion and fire out at the Whitby home. Send back for help if necessary. Now use some speed." I used some speed, and when I got into the ambulance, the driver used some more. We tore up the street at a hazardous rate, the chauffeur giving himself over to the task of driving, while I turned the crank that ran the shrieking signal on. The so-called Whitby home was an obscure little institution occupying a shabby 10-room brick building in a low-class residence district in the outskirts of the city. The place bore a rather evil reputation, and it was hinted that its owner and operator, Dr. Whitby, was guilty of various illegal practices in connection with his hospital work. However, no complaint of any importance had ever been lodged against him, and consequently no investigation of his activities had ever taken place, and the general opinion of his character remained unconfirmed. For aught I knew, the rumours about Whitby might have been born of the natural resentment of all medical men toward a practitioner who declines to be governed by the standards and becomes therefore a quack. For Whitby had belonged to no medical society. He was careless about collecting anything for his work, and he practiced any kind of medical theory, old or new, that happened to appeal to him, totally disregarding the ethics of the profession. He had no general practice, and the inmates of his would-be sanitarium were usually people of little learning and nearly always the victims of disabling accidents. I must mention, however, that my gratification at the thought of investigating the Whitby home and some of its curious inmates entirely overcame my resentment at losing most of a night's sleep. In a matter of seconds, we drew up as near the place as we could get, the fire department having the narrower street blocked. The building was almost completely gutted by the fire when we arrived, and grabbing my first aid kit, I ran up to the captain who was directing the firefighting to inquire about the victims. "Only one alive," he panted. "Rest all killed in the explosion. Come over here." The survivor, whose room had been on the ground floor, had not been injured by the accident, although he had been stunned temporarily by the shock of the explosion. The fireman had wrapped him in a blanket salvaged from the burning house and laid him in a sheltered place to await the ambulance. Passing the mangled bodies of the dead, we found him sitting up, looking a little dazed at the excitement, but feeling cheerful and apparently comfortable. He was a common-looking little man of probably 30 years, a laborer of not very extensive intellect, but alert and sensible in answering our questions. He had been staying at the place on account of the amputation of his left arm a little above the elbow. I sat by his side and returned to the hospital and questioned him regarding the cause of the fire. "Gas or gasoline explosion, I guess," he responded readily. "Fox, the fellow that did the odd work around the house, was in my room along about 10 o'clock and sat there and talked to me a while. Finally, he said he smelled something like gasoline or escaping gas that seemed to come down the stairs, and he went up to see to it. After a while, I heard him open the door at the top of the stairway, and that's about all I knew till I came to out there in the yard. Something must have blown the whole top of the house to pieces. I was lucky, for I was the only one who slept downstairs." "Are any of the rest of them alive?" "No, not a soul," I told him. The patient's face betrayed genuine regret at this. "Too bad. Doc Whitby was a good fellow. I got this arm cut off in a smash-up over at the barrel stave mill, and Doc Whitby just happened along before I even got it wrapped up, and he took me in and took care of it ever since and never asked for $1. I had a couple of weeks' wages with me, and I turned that over to him, but he didn't seem very anxious to get it. Wanted me to wait and see what a nice job he had done on the arm. Some new scheme he had." Arriving at the hospital, I installed my patient in a ward bed made out his record card and the name he gave me, Simon Glaze, and then proceeding to look after the dressing on his arm, which I found soaking wet. I removed this and applied iodoform gauze, dry, covering it with a linen bandage. "Aren't you going to soak it up?" he asked. "Soak it? No, that's no way to take care of a stump. Doc Whitby kept it wet all the time." "It's a new one to me," I told him. "We always keep wounds like that clean and dry. You'll be all right with this dressing." "Well, maybe," he said doubtfully as I left him. The next morning I went in for a look at my patient, who appeared to have spent a rather bad night. "Doc," he began eagerly, "couldn't you stretch a point and wet this bandage for me? I haven't slept a wink all night with the dry rag on it." I wondered what kind of faith cure Whitby had been practicing on Glaze, and I maintained my position that the wet bandage was not the proper treatment. Glaze stared at me with red, sleepless eyes, misery showing in every line of his face. "Doc," he finally said, "I want to talk to the regular top boss of this concern, and I want him pretty soon." We had considerable argument over this, but ultimately I went and brought up Dr. Lang in compliance with Glaze's request. Glaze had been lying face down on his bed during my absence, and when Dr. Lang and I returned, we opened the felted door with its silent latch without a particle of noise, and had stepped into the room before Glaze was aware of our approach. Dr. Lang started to speak, and his heavy voice broke on the stillness of the room with quite a jar. The effect on the patient was most startling. He gathered his legs and his good arm under him like a flash and sprang backward, clear onto the next bed, which fortunately for its occupant was empty at the time, the patient being in the dressing room. Lang gasped. "Aha! A mental case, as I might have suspected." He crossed quickly to where the patient lay, still crouched in the same posture, speechless, doubled up. The doctor laid a hand on him, spoke to him, turned him over to his back, all without evoking a word from Glaze, who lay with eyes half closed like a man playing dead. "Well, let's have a look at the arm anyhow," said Lang, and proceeded to uncover the unresisting man's stump. "Bare-looking job," he commented. "No infection, but just doesn't look right. I suppose Whitby was trying some wildcat scheme on him, and so long as he has no infection, maybe we'd continue it for a while just to keep him calmed down. Then we'll gradually break in on some reliable modern treatment. Didn't you say he was perfectly rational last night?" "He certainly was." "Next time he has a looser interval, just call me, will you, Marsh? No matter what I'm doing. This is an interesting case, and I'd like to know what the late Whitby has been doing to him." Sometime later in the day, Glaze recovered his poise, and Dr. Lang talked to him at length, questioning him about the treatment administered by Dr. Whitby, but the answers only increased our curiosity. Glaze admitted that he had been under chloroform a number of times since Whitby had first cared for his arm stump, which seemed rather unusual to us. Questioned as to the purpose of this, he said he didn't believe the arm had ever been touched when he was under the anesthetic, as it was never sore afterwards. There was an injury in the roof of his mouth that bled a good deal, he said, and there were little sore spots on his back that were quite painful for a day or two. And then he finished, "There was a good deal of time I can't remember at all. Guess I've been kind of feverish or something, for there's been long stretches of time go by that I can't remember anything. This morning was one of them. And say, doctor, I wonder if you could fix it so I can have a bath pretty often, say every day or twice a day. I don't want much hot water, just plain cold is good enough for me. Doc Whitby always let me bathe 2 or 3 times a day, and I just can't seem to get enough of it." Dr. Lang was interested enough to assent to this, although he hardly expected to collect a cent from the patient. He was retaining Glaze for the satisfaction of his private curiosity. "That's the weirdest case I ever saw or heard of," said Dr. Lang to me later. "Call it intermittent insanity if you want to, but he hasn't a trace of fever nor a sign of locomotor ataxia, both of which lunatics practically always have. In fact, when he's in those silent fits, his temperature is actually below normal. And how he takes to water. Whatever is wrong with him, it isn't hydrophobia." I prepared Glaze bath for him several times, and he demanded water that was practically unheated, although the time was early winter and the temperature outside was well below freezing. Glaze was removed to a room by himself with a bath attached, where his eccentricities would bother no one else, and during the next 2 weeks he showed very little change in symptoms. I was careful not to startle him unduly, but even under the most careful treatment, he still showed that curious inclination to double up into a ball and go backward, always backward, away from anyone who approached him. His talkative intervals grew shorter, and if allowed, he would spend hours in his tub of cold water, hardly moving a muscle. Making an examination of the arm stump one morning, I noted for the first time 3 or 4 little warty growths in the suture where the skin had been drawn together over the stump. As the patient was feeling apparently normal at the time, I held a hand mirror up to the stump so that he could see the warts too, and told him that they would probably have to be cut off. He looked intently at the reflection at the end of the stump for a few seconds, and then turned to me with a startled expression in his face and voice. "Don't cut them off," he pleaded, and on the instant it doubled up again into a ball, rolling on the floor of the dressing room like a wooden thing. When I told Dr. Lang of the incident, his curiosity at Clay's behavior put a severe strain on the good doctor's self-control. "If that man Whitby were alive today," he remarked with studied restraint, "I would be inclined to put him on the operating table and persuade the truth out of him with a red-hot iron. It's some devilish work of his that makes a man act like a dried armadillo every time anyone looks at him. And that subnormal temperature. Where does he get it?" 2 days later, we took the somewhat unwilling Glaze into the operating room to care for his unhealthy stump. Dr. Lang, of course, superintended the work, and the actual cutting had been turned over to my fellow intern, a young Irishman named Lansinger, with a flaming red head and a likable manner, whom everyone considered to be destined for a brilliant future. As I gradually whiffed the ether into the patient's nostrils, Lansinger was busy unwrapping the stump. When the cut-off member was exposed, Lansinger's eyes rested for only a second on the bits of flesh he was expected to remove, then his whole face changed as if he had been struck with a club. "Holy cats!" he gasped, his lips turning grey-white. "Cut out the ether, Marsh. I don't want to operate on that." He stopped and turned toward Dr. Lang, who was little nonplussed at Lansinger's sudden refusal to carry out his commission. "Pardon my abruptness, doctor," apologized Lansinger to his superior, "but I'd like to have 6 or 7 days' time before going ahead with this cutting." "You would like it?" "Yes, doctor. If you'll give me a week before you disturb this man's arm, I think I can tell you something about the Honorable Dr. Whitby's work that'll make your eyes open. But I've just got to have that much time." 1 week, ruminated the superintendent slowly. "Won't kill nor cure him in his present condition. I presume we can wait that long. But aren't you forgetting that I am in charge here, and that this man is being kept here solely on my responsibility? Do you have to be so extremely reticent with your theories? I feel that I am entitled to know something about what you think you have discovered." "I know what Whitby has done," said Lansinger simply, "and in a week I can tell you what he did it with. Can I have that much time?" "Yes, take your week," exploded the doctor with some irritation. "But I am holding you strictly responsible for the condition of this patient." "That's all right. That's what I want. And I still think you might give me an idea of what you're talking about." "Take a look at that then," pointing to the bared stump. Dr. Lang scrutinized the growths. As he had not recently been reading on the subject that had given Lansinger his sudden inspiration, it is possible that he did not see anything definite on Glaz's arm. Also, it is possible that in his dignified conservatism he doubted even his own eyesight. But as he retreated, dissatisfied and silent, I bent close and looked. What I saw took my breath away and made me wonder if I were really awake. Lansinger hurried away, and I trundled the unconscious Glaze back to his bed. During the next 2 days, Glaze lost nearly all that was left of his normal human instincts and speech. He moved and obeyed mechanically when spoken to, but seemed to understand motion better than speech, so that it was often necessary for me to point to a thing in order to make him comprehend what I wanted. His mania for the cold bath increased, and if I went into his room quietly in the early morning, I frequently found him doubled into the familiar ball, sleeping with his eyes half open. Observing Glaze's eyes so much brought out another revelation. Upon first seeing the man, I had noticed his bright, intelligent-looking eyes, which were rather prominent. But now, since his recent prolonged lapses into semi-consciousness, I noticed that his eyes were sunk deeper into his head and seemed to be losing their lustre. Now, this condition might be induced by anemia or something of the sort, but Glaze was in the pink of physical condition and not in the least emaciated, and I was at loss to explain the change in his eyes. He had certainly grown less talkative at the same time, and vaguely I wondered if something were influencing a part of his brain, causing it to shrink, and thus, by natural consequences, causing his eyes to sink farther back in the bony structure. As I sat observing him, it suddenly struck me that the crown of his head seemed to be less prominent than when I first saw him. and after a careful survey, I was positive that the man's head was losing its prominent crown and sinking into a more brutish line. Of course, any physician knows that a man's skull can change shape in the course of time if something happens to develop a new portion of his brain, just as the bones in a coal heaver's shoulder bent under his heavy loads. But a change like that in one's skull would hardly be perceptible in less than 2 or 3 years. An apparent alteration in the shape of Glaze's skull in the 3 weeks we have known him seemed like a preposterous dream of some kind. Not wishing further to upset my good superior, Dr. Lang, I kept still about this weird discovery until Lancy returned to the hospital that evening, he having been out by special permission all day. Late that night I brought Lancy up and told him about the patient's eyes and asked him what he could see in the shape of his head. While Glaze lay in habitual stupor, Lancy felt of his head and turned it right and left. Then he placed his hands behind him and said, "It all fits together perfectly. But my God, where will it end?" I could only stare at my friend. "I've got it, Marsh. I've got the whole story up to date. And I don't know but that it would be a kind deed to chloroform this poor wretch and let him out of it. I never dreamed it would work so fast. Tomorrow, Marsh, I'll tell all of you what I have found out." And Lancy went back to the laboratory. I now studied Glaze's habits more closely than ever, for I did want to get some idea about the mysterious case before Lancy had to tell me every detail as if I were a child. Glaze was not inactive all the time. He varied between his rolled-up playing dead attitude and sudden snappy erratic movements. He was beginning to snap at his food and devour it hastily, almost without chewing, and this habit caused him some little stomachic disturbance, as of course it would with anybody. In his frequent visits to the bathtub, he would dive for long periods beneath the surface of the water and come up half-strangled, yet seeming to enjoy it all. And if anything surprised or startled him, it was always backward that he retreated from it, backward and suddenly. Finding time to visit Glaze along in the afternoon, I dropped into his room and found him sitting up in his chair, apparently his old cheerful self. I spoke to him gently and without startling him, and he smiled and looked as if he would like to reply, but simply could not. Hoping to draw him out into more conversation, I sat down beside him and continued talking to him about little things around the house with which he was familiar. Finally, unsuccessful in getting Glaze to talk, I playfully shook hands with him, preparing to leave. The hand that gripped mine nearly broke 3 of my fingers, and smile left Glaze's face as he shut down on me with a grip of inhuman strength. Tugging at his hand with my own left, in an effort to free my sadly pinched right member, I saw that his thumb reached clear across my own very large palm and almost an inch to spare. How could I have escaped noticing that huge thumb before? Then I saw the nail. It bore a sharp ridge, like the gable roof of a house, down its center, and it occupied the entire end joint of that monstrous thumb. This certainly had not been the case when I had held Glaze's right hand a few days previously while administering chloroform to him. When I finally extricated my right hand, Glaze kept opening and shutting that huge pincer with a motion that reminded me of the jaws of a hungry alligator. What was the superhuman influence that caused a man's firmest tissues to alter their shape completely within a few hours? And what was it that ghastly gripping claw resembled? I left the room with cold chills running up my spine. The next morning, Lancy arranged to explain to Dr. Lang 2 or 3 other doctors who had become interested and myself regarding his findings about the mysterious patient, for which purpose they gathered in Dr. Lang's back office at 10:30 o'clock. You may be assured that it was a highly interested little group that gathered in that room considerably before 10:30, Dr. Lang himself being almost rabidly impatient. "Well, shoot, Lancy," he said before the door had closed behind the last man, and Lancy shot. "There's just one man in the room, I think, who saw and understand what was growing on the end of a patient's arm a week ago today. At that time it was 4 perfectly good little fingers and a model thumb." This statement was greeted with voiceless gasps. "It's something different now. In fact, I hardly know what to call it in its present form, but we'll go up and look at it presently. Anyhow, it's now perfectly plain that what Whitby tried to do, and partially succeeded in doing, was to modify the regenerative process in his patients so that a new forearm would grow in place of the lost one. The theory is nothing very new. As early as 1906, it was observed that when a limb was amputated at the middle of a bone, the bone starts to grow out again but increases only about 1/50th of an inch in length before it is halted by some other influence. You know also, of course, about little warts of so-called proud flesh that apparently try to replace the original muscular tissue in case of injuries, but which are misshapen or misplaced. What Whitby was trying to get at, as I see it, was to so control these misdirected efforts of nature as to produce a new and perfect limb. The human body is already able to repair damaged bones by rebuilding the small particles of the bony tissue. It is also able to replace muscle, nerve, and even fingernail tissue, although in somewhat imperfect form. Whitby was trying to induce it to build a lost member in perfect form. Seeking this result, his studies naturally took him to observing the water animals that have this power of regeneration. A crab, for instance, when it gets a limb broken, promptly bites off the rest of the limb and a new one grows in its place. The same is true of the lobster family, down to the tiny crawdad no larger than a cricket. Specimens of these creatures are frequently found with one limb far smaller than the others as a result of such occurrences. It seems that Whitby has been experimenting for years with ductless and other glands of shellfish in pursuance of this theory of regeneration, and we have upstairs the living proof that he was able to prepare a glandular extract that changes the bodily cell structure as well as influencing the building up process of nature, but it appears that he never succeeded in isolating one influence from the other, both being present in his preparation. I found that Whitby brought the little crawdads, which are really dwarf lobsters, from children around his neighborhood, and that his purchases ran into tens of thousands of these little creatures, and I also find that he brought live lobsters in a quantity that his dining table would never have warranted. In short, this patient Simon Glaze has had his body so saturated with the glandular extracts from lobsters that he was actually developing regenerative powers, and the bits of proud flesh on his arm stump, which you saw only a week ago, became quite well developed fingers. At that time, of course, they were getting natural human material for their reconstruction. All that has changed now, and as a result of the other influence of his medication, he is now coming more and more every day to resemble a gigantic shellfish in both body and mind, if a shellfish can be credited with a mind. You remember what he told about a wound in the top of his mouth? That was the easiest access to the region of his pituitary gland, a seat of powerful influence over any structural change in the man's body. Other injections were administered along his spinal column, and I firmly believe that Whitby was successful in providing the man with something that he has used since Whitby's death in promoting the change, not understanding the real results. I objected a moment to state that Glaze had positively had possessed of nothing he had brought from the Whitby home. At that, Dr. Lang leaped to his feet, suppressing an oath. "I've got it," he ejaculated, his steel blue eyes snapping. This infernal lunatic Whitby was afraid somebody would take his patient away from him before he got through his nice little experiments. So he just lodged bodies of oil-soluble extracts along his spinal column, where they would continue to be picked up in the lymph. In this way he has gone on poisoning and wrecking this poor wretch of a labourer after he himself is dead, and in wherever such people belong. We'll go up now and have an X-ray made and see if anything can be done. The unfinished lecture broke up, and Lancy, Lang, and I went up to Glaze's room immediately. As we waited for the elevator, Lancy finished explaining to Dr. Lang. That nice little set of fingers is now turned to almost perfect lobster claw, only 2 fingers of the original 5 having developed, both with scissor-like claws. His good right hand is today nearer a lobster claw than anything else. His speech is gone. His temperature is 93 degrees instead of a normal 98. His backward leaps when startled are the behavior of a crawfish. And the occipital bones of his head are shrinking day by day. Above all, note his fondness of water, especially on his stump. A crab could not grow a new limb except in a wet place. He hurried into Glaze's room and on to his bathroom beyond, where he spent so much time. In the tub full of cold water, we found Glaze's nude body, doubled and curled up, face far down under the water, dead. "Poor devil," said Lancy, as we extracted the body and laid it upon the bed. His lobster brain taught him that the only safe place for him was underwater, but he lacked the lobster's breathing apparatus. Well, it's better this way after all. The end of A Hand from the Deep.